Good afternoon, Black family. This is Ephraim B. Martin. I am 58 years of age, and I'm the father of 4 adult daughters, 35, 29, 26, and 23. Welcome, Black family. The reason I am here today is I am doing a second live stream. Black family, I normally do one live stream a week, and I did one yesterday. And I'm back for day 2 of a totally different live stream. And what I'm going to be addressing today, Black family, is the Black Manosphere. Black culture is our problem. Let me repeat that. Black Manosphere. Black culture is our problem. You know, Black family, about a year ago, January of 2023 to May of 2023, I did research on over 300 videos on Black content creators in the Black Manosphere. Red pill. And the reason why I did that research is because over the last 3 years, you know, after speaking with my daughters and many other young women, I have been hearing about millennial and Gen Z men just being very, very disrespectful towards women. My daughters were telling me that a lot of these men are just aggressive, talk crazy, and they just didn't understand where a lot of these men were coming from. So I decided to, like I said, it was about 3 years ago. I decided last year just to go ahead and do some research. So I watched 300 videos, each of them 3 times. So it was pretty extensive in my research. And I got to tell you, Black family, what I came across in the Black Manosphere was very, very disturbing when it comes to modern women. Now, the Black Manosphere, or any Manosphere today, what it represents is you have a bunch of men that have come together. They call themselves men's activists or whatever they want to call themselves. And they're just pretty much anti-women. And it's a gender war. Most of these men have a problem with women. Most of these men have a problem with feminists. And it's just a gender war. They really don't like women. So I decided to research and see what I could come up with and, you know, have a clearer understanding of exactly, you know, what's going on with millennial and Gen Z men. Let me give you a little bit of information about myself. I worked in the criminal justice system for 20 years, and I worked in K-12 education for 10 years. So I spent 30 years in 2 different educational systems, criminal justice system and K-12 education. I've worked with all children from all socioeconomic backgrounds and their parents. My bachelor's degree is in criminal justice and economics. It's a double major. That's what I majored in college. And the reason I majored in criminal justice and economics is because I needed to fully understand the economic ramifications of the criminal justice system. So that's my professional background, Black family. It's pretty extensive. I'm a legal researcher. I've been researching law since 1984. I was a paralegal in the United States Marine Corps from 1984 to 1988. That's what I did when I was in the Marine Corps. I was a paralegal. So very thorough and familiar with the law on the defense side as well as the prosecution side. And I'm just I'm a legal researcher. I'm a damn good one too. So like I said, family, I decided to do this research, and these 300 videos from these Black content creators, absolutely horrible. Absolutely horrible. One of the things that I noticed early on in my research, which was very consistent, was all of the foolishness and all of the nonsense that was in these videos. And a lot of the men that have these, YouTube channels. They call themselves content creators. They are preaching to younger men not to get married, which is kind of crazy because apparently some of them are married, not all of them, but apparently some of them are married. And I have to ask the question, what are married men doing in a single man space, for one, if you're happily married? And the second question to that would be is, who are your wives? And why would they allow you to be in this space? Creating chaos and just it's crazy. I don't understand. If you're a married man, why would you be giving advice to a single man who's childless not to get married if you're married? That sounds like hypocrisy to me. That's just absolutely insane to me. That's crazy to me. So, Black family, I did the research on these videos, and like I said, very, very disturbing. And I've got a huge problem with the Black Manosphere. Okay, because they come off like they're just a bunch of black men that are getting together and self-improvement and trying to help Gen Z men become better, which is straight up bullshit. The Black Manosphere is straight up bullshit. There's a lot of bullshit men in the Black Manosphere, and I'm just not having it, any of it. My generation, Gen X men, we are not tolerating or endorsing the foolishness of millennials and Gen Z. We have a disconnect between Gen X men, millennials, and Gen Z, because millennials and Gen Z have decided, since Gen X men, we get blamed for everything that they do. They don't take accountability for their actions, and it's always someone else. But since Gen X men get the blame for everything, the one thing we're not going to take the blame for, millennial and Gen Z man, is this chaos you've created through social media engineering. Can't blame us for that because we didn't grow up on it like you did. So you're going to have to own that at some point, millennial and Gen Z man. But the Black Manosphere, very, very dangerous as far as I'm concerned. The way they come at women, particularly single Black women, mothers, the way they come at them, they come hard for women. When you look at a lot of these videos and you just see how these Black men are disrespectful and deceptive to women, telling women you need to get on my page. That's very interesting. Get on my page. What does that mean exactly, Black millennial and Gen Z men? You come from the same households of many of these single Black mothers. You were raised by single women. So you're making it appear like there's something wrong with them being raised by a single mother. You're just as fatherless. You have just as many issues as these women talking about get on my page. Let me guess, the page of you taking them down a rabbit hole so you could ruin them financially and emotionally, right? Is that the page you're talking about, Black millennial and Gen Z men? Y'all horrible. And most of you don't have a pot to piss in. Talking about get on my page, do what I say. Explain to me, being raised without a single father, how are you better than women who were raised who were raised by their mothers? Explain that to me, Black millennial and Gen Z men. Because you join the Black Manosphere without doing your research, without providing any studies, and without coming with any solutions. Because you don't do research, and you sure as hell don't read any books. I know this because I did the research. So it's a sad situation today, fathers. It really, really is. Black fathers, it's crazy. There's such a disconnect. I can't even explain it because this is foreign to me. This is new to me. And just the not taking accountability part. Gen Z men won't take accountability for, they just ain't gonna take accountability. It's never their fault. Blame women, modern women. Oh, they're masculine. Oh, they're aggressive. Oh, they don't listen. Y'all some weak ass men. For real. Y'all straight up weak ass men. Millennial and Gen Z men. Y'all the weakest men out of all the generation of men since slavery. You are. You're the most emotional. You're the most feminist. You are. And when these YouTube channels that y'all following gossip like women, worse than women, sound like a bunch of hens. Y'all horrible, man. And I'm bothered on every level. I'm bothered by a millennial and Black Gen Z man in the manosphere, the Black manosphere, because y'all listen to anything and you follow anything. And since you don't do any research or any studies, you don't even know what you're doing. You don't know who you're following and why you're following them. It's insane how someone older than you can come into your life, tell you some bullshit, and you fall in line with it. But then again, that's how simple most of you are. So I get it. Okay, Black family. I have 3 videos I want to present to you today by a man of Dr. Thomas Sowell. He's an economist. He's a brilliant man. I came across Dr. Thomas Sowell when I was in college in 1989. And he was one of the main reasons why I decided to get a double major in criminal justice and economics, because after studying him, it made sense for me to understand the economic ramifications of the criminal justice system. So I did that. And I'm glad that I did that, because my education has always helped me. It's never hindered me. It's always helped me. The reason I'm before you today and being able to explain what I'm able to explain today is because of my education. There's absolutely no way on God's green earth I would have ever been able to become a probation officer without a bachelor's degree. I wouldn't have ever been able to be a dean of students or a teacher without a bachelor's degree, because that's the minimum requirement. So I'm grateful and I'm thankful, Black family. Okay, let's get into these videos, Black family. Give me a second here. Dr. Thomas Sowell, economist.
Much of the cultural pattern of Southern rednecks became the cultural heritage of Southern blacks, more so than survivals of African cultures with which they had not been in contact for centuries. Even in colonial times, most blacks on American soil had been born on American soil. Moreover, such cultural traits followed blacks out of the southern countrysides and into the urban ghettos, north and south, where many settled. The very way of talking, later to be christened Black English, closely followed dialects brought over from those parts of Britain from which many white Southerners came, though these speech patterns died out in Britain while surviving in the American South, as such speech patterns would later die out among most Southern whites and among middle-class blacks, while surviving in the poorer black ghettos around the country. For example, where a Northerner said, "I am," "You are," "She isn't," "It doesn't," and "I haven't," a Virginian, even of high rank, preferred to say, "I be," "You be," "She ain't," "It don't," and "I hain't." These Virginia speech ways were not invented in America. They derived from a family or regional dialects that had been spoken throughout the South and West of England during the 17th century. From these same regions of England came such words as yaller for yellow, axe for ask, acrost for across, y'all for you, bile for boil, do for door, dis for this, and that for that. Many of these usages have long since died out in England, though the word chitlins for hogging trails continued to be used in some localities in England, even in the 20th century, as such usage remained common among Black Americans. But no such words came from Africa, nor did the holiday Kwanzaa, which originated in Los Angeles. The slaves' custom of marking their marriages by jumping over a broomstick, a custom resurrected at a posh wedding among blacks in 20th century New York as a mark of racial identity, was in fact a pagan custom in Europe in centuries past, and survived for a time among Southern whites. Complaints about the improvidence of whites in the South and of their ancestors in Britain before that were echoed in W.E.B. Du Bois's picture of his fellow blacks in the 1890s. Probably few poor nations waste more money by thoughtless and unreasonable expenditure than the American Negro, and especially those living in large cities. Thousands of dollars are annually wasted in amusements of various kinds and in miscellaneous ornaments and gewgaws. The Negro has much to learn of the Jew and the Italian as to living within his means and saving every penny from excessive and wasteful expenditures. It was not, however, from Jews or Italians that blacks had absorbed their culture. Du Bois's description of the spending habits of blacks in the 1890s was echoed by a contemporary observer, Jacob Riis, who said that the Negro loves fine clothes and good living a good deal more than he does a bank account. Similar observations have been made by many others over the years, inside and outside the black community. For the lower socioeconomic classes among blacks, Gunnar Myrdal's descriptions of them near the middle of the 20th century still bore a remarkable resemblance to descriptions of Southern whites and their regional forebears in Britain, including less resourcefulness, disorganized family life, lax sexual morals, and recklessness, with tendencies toward aggression and violence. Despite a generally sympathetic approach to the study of blacks in his landmark book, An American Dilemma, which has often been credited with a major influence on the advancement of civil rights, Myrdal also noted the low standards of efficiency, reliability, ambition, and morals actually displayed by the average Negro. He observed something of the devil-may-care attitude in the pleasure-seeking of Negroes, and a general attitude in which life becomes cheap and crime not so reprehensible. Like other observers, Myrdal tended to attribute to slavery such aspects of black culture as the low regard for human life, when in fact, antebellum whites had exhibited this same reckless disregard of lethal dangers, and so had their ancestors in Britain. Unlike many others, however, Myrdal also recognized the influence of the Southern white culture on the culture of blacks, pointing out that the general Southern pattern of illegality maintained this low regard for human life. He also noted that the so-called Negro dialect is simply a variation on the ordinary Southern accent, that religious emotionalism was borrowed from and sanctioned by religious behavior among whites in the South, and that the Negro trait of audaciousness is characteristic of white Southerners too. He quoted black scholar and later statesman Ralph Bunche. White Southerners employ many of the defense mechanisms characteristic of the Negro. They often carry a chip on the shoulder. They indulge freely in self-commiseration. They rather typically and in real Negro fashion try to overcome a feeling of inferiority by exhibitionism, raucousness in dress, and exaggerated self-assertion. Although Dr. Bunche presented these as parallels, historically it was, of course, the Southern whites who first had these patterns, reflecting patterns among their ancestors in Britain. In much of the literature on black culture, however, the supposed influence of slavery has been far more sweepingly assumed, and the cultural influence of white Southerners and their forebears in Britain largely ignored. Attempts to derive the black manner of speaking from slavery and its parallel among whites as an influence from black speech were answered by a Southern historian who asked, "From whence came the drawl of the people of the upper Great Plains and of the Blue Ridge, Smoky, and Cumberland Mountains, who have had little or no contact with the Negro?" Another cultural historian of Southerners aptly observed that Southerners, white and black, share the bonds of a common heritage, indeed a common tragedy, and often speak a common language, however seldom they may acknowledge it. Half a century after Myrdal, another study of racial attitudes noted the intimidating ethnic style of many underclass black males, and noted that nearly half of all murder victims in America were black, and that 94% of them were killed by other blacks. Many of these killings were due to gang members who killed for such reasons as, "'cause you look at me funny, 'cause you give me no respect," and other reasons reminiscent of the touchy pride and hair-trigger violence of rednecks and crackers in an earlier era. The neglect and disdain of education found among antebellum white Southerners has been echoed not only in low performance levels among ghetto blacks, but perhaps most dramatically in a hostility toward those black students who are conscientious about their studies, who are accused of acting white, a charge that can bring anything from social ostracism to outright violence. So much attention has been paid to questions of ability that few have looked at cultural attitudes. One of those who has is Black professor and best-selling author Shelby Steele, who sees in many of these children almost a determination not to learn, even though, once outside the school and in their own neighborhoods, these same children learn everything. He drew on his own experiences teaching at a university. For some years, I have noticed that I can walk into any of my classes on the first day of the semester, identify the Black students, and be sadly confident that on the last day of the semester, a disproportionate number of them will be at the bottom of the class, far behind any number of white students of equal or even lesser ability. Statistical data substantiate these impressions. Black students typically perform academically below the level of those white students with the same mental test scores, in contrast to Asian American students, who perform better than white students with the same test scores as themselves. In short, even though Black students average lower test scores than either white or Asian American students, those test scores are not necessarily the sole, nor perhaps even the predominant, reason for lower Black academic achievement. Indeed, it is possible that the lower test scores may be a result of cultural attitudes and of actions or inactions over a period of years based on those attitudes, more so than a cause of academic failures. While it has long been known that, historically, the average IQ of Blacks has been about 85, compared to a national average of 100, what has not been so widely known is that the average IQ of Blacks in the North was for years consistently higher than that of Blacks in the South. A 1942 study of freshmen at Black colleges found the superiority of freshmen from northern schools over those from southern schools was found to persist throughout the colleges. As already noted, Black soldiers from some northern states scored higher on mental tests than whites from some southern states during the First World War. From that same era, European immigrants from cultures where education was not a high priority for ordinary people, parts of Eastern and Southern Europe, for example, scored no higher on mental tests than American Blacks, and, in some communities, their children scored lower than Northern Black children attending the same schools. The low test scores of some European immigrant children cannot be automatically attributed to their being new to the United States. There have been settled communities of whites with test scores similar to those of Blacks, where these have been culturally isolated people, such as the inhabitants of the Hebrides Islands off Scotland, or people living in Tennessee mountain communities, hillbillies, or inhabitants of canal boat communities in Britain. In short, some kinds of cultures tend to produce lower mental test scores, whether the people in those cultures are Black or white, American or European. As someone has aptly said, the tests are not unfair. Life is unfair, and the tests measure the results. No one chooses which culture to be born into, or can be blamed for how that culture evolved in centuries past. In business ownership, as in other ways, the pattern among Black Americans has followed the pattern of rednecks in earlier times, with people from other groups owning most of the businesses in Black neighborhoods. Some may try to explain the lack of locally owned businesses in the ghettos by racial discrimination or poverty, but as early as the 1920s, there were numerous Black-owned businesses in Harlem, the majority of which were owned by Blacks from the Caribbean, not Blacks from the American South, who were the majority population of Harlem. Although New York was the principal destination of Blacks from the Caribbean, then as now, the 1930 census showed that there were more than 4 times as many native-born Blacks in Manhattan as there were foreign-born Blacks. In a parallel to differences between Southern and non-Southern whites, a study of West Indian Blacks in the United States noted that the Negro immigrants, particularly the British West Indians, bring a zest of learning that is not typical of the native-born population. While Black Americans have long been overrepresented among people in prison, a study of the racial composition of New York State's Sing Sing prison in the early 1930s found that Black West Indians were underrepresented relative to their share of the population, at a time when native-born Black Americans were overrepresented several-fold among Sing Sing inmates. During that same era, when American-born Black women and West Indian Black women both worked in New York City's garment district, the latter were more frequently found at the skilled tasks. More generally, The study found that the Black immigrant brings a cultural heritage that is vastly different from that of the American Negro. The first Black borough presidents of Manhattan were West Indians. As late as 1970, the highest-ranking Blacks in New York's police department were West Indians, as were all the Black federal judges in the city. The 1970 census showed that Black West Indian families in the New York metropolitan area had 28% higher incomes than the families of American Blacks. The incomes of second-generation West Indian families living in the same area exceeded that of Black families by 58%. Neither race nor racism can explain such differences, nor can slavery, since native-born Blacks and West Indian Blacks both had a history of slavery. Studies published in 2004 indicated that an absolute majority of the Black alumni of Harvard were either West Indian or African immigrants, or the children of these immigrants. Somewhat similar findings have emerged in studies of some other elite colleges. With Blacks, as with whites, the redneck culture has been a less achieving culture. Moreover, that culture has affected a higher proportion of the Black population than of the white population, since only about 1/3 of all whites lived in the antebellum South, while 9/10 of all Blacks did. From the 1960s onward, much of the transplanted Southern culture would, like Black English, be seen as sacrosanct features of a distinctive Black identity, despite their mirroring very similar cultural patterns among Southern whites in times past. Not all Black Americans, of course, retain this anachronistic culture, for the spread of education and the growing experience of the counterproductive effects of the Southern redneck way of life eroded it over time for many Blacks, as happened also among the whites who brought this culture over from Britain. Even during the era of slavery, those Blacks who were house servants in more educated homes tended to pick up a different culture, giving their descendants enduring advantages over the descendants of field hands. Contemporary Black ghetto culture in the United States is not, however, a simple linear extrapolation from the culture of Southern whites. First of all, most Black Americans today are no longer part of the ghetto culture. Moreover, aside from influences peculiar to the circumstances of Blacks, profound changes in the larger American society around them have also had an influence, both positive and negative. The burgeoning of the American welfare state in the second half of the 20th century and the declining effectiveness of the American criminal justice system at the same time allowed borrowed and counterproductive cultural traits to continue and flourish among those Blacks who had not yet moved beyond that culture, thereby prolonging the life of a chaotic, counterproductive, dangerous, and self-destructive subculture in many urban ghettos. Crime and violence were among the features of this subculture that were artificially prolonged. Prior to the 1960s, while Black males had a higher murder rate than other males, their murder rate was also declining more sharply than the general murder rate. Subsequently, the general murder rate in the United States and the murder rate for Black males both reversed and began rising sharply, that of Black males more sharply than others. In short, the drastic changes in law enforcement and social morality during the 1960s had particularly adverse effects on the behavior and actions of Blacks, and on Black victims of the criminals in their midst. Intellectuals have also played a role, along with the welfare state, in prolonging and legitimizing a counterproductive culture among Blacks. Nowhere was the effect of the white liberalism of the 1960s on the social evolution of Black culture more devastating than in the disintegration of the Black family. The raw facts are these. As of 1960, 51% of Black females between the ages of 15 and 44 were married and living with their husbands. Another 20% were divorced, widowed, or separated. And only 28% had never been married. 20 years later, only 31% of Black women in these age brackets were married and living with their husbands, while 48% had never married. By 1994, an absolute majority, 56%, of Black women in these age brackets were never married, and only 25% were married and living with their husbands. Accordingly, while 2/3 of Black children were living with both parents in 1960, only 1/3 were by 1994. While only 22% of Black children were born to unmarried women in 1960, 70% were by 1994. White liberals, instead of comparing what has happened to the black family since the liberal welfare state policies of the 1960s were put into practice, compare black families to white families, and conclude that the higher rates of broken homes and unwed motherhood among blacks are due to a legacy of slavery. But why the large-scale disintegration of the black family should have begun 100 years after slavery is left unexplained. Whatever the situation of the black family relative to the white family, in the past or the present, it is clear that broken homes were far more common among blacks at the end of the 20th century than they were in the middle of that century or at the beginning of that century, even though blacks at the beginning of the 20th century were just one generation out of slavery. The widespread and casual abandonment of their children and of the women who bore them by black fathers in the ghettos of the late 20th century was, in fact, a painfully ironic contrast with what had happened in the immediate aftermath of slavery 100 years earlier, when observers in the South reported desperate efforts of freed blacks to find family members who had been separated from them during the era of slavery. A contemporary journalist reported meeting black men walking along the roads of Virginia and North Carolina, many of whom had walked across the state or across more than one state looking for their families. Others reported similar strenuous and even desperate efforts of newly freed blacks to find members of their families.
Okay, Black family. That was one of 3 videos. Question Black Manosphere. How does it feel to know that you're black rednecks? Because I know many of you didn't even know it. You're black rednecks. And the thing about it is, since you don't do any research, provide studies, or come with solutions, you just join shit. And whatever you're told to do, you fall in line. And it's just absolutely crazy to me. I do not understand these 300 videos that I researched. I do not, Black Millennial and Gen Z, man. I don't understand. I don't understand your anger. I don't understand the hatred you have towards women. So if you're disrespecting women the way that you do, I know you don't respect your mothers. You don't respect your sisters, your aunts, your girl cousins, your nieces. You can't. Because you come hard for black women. And that's a problem. That's really a problem. Dr. Thomas Sowell is a brilliant man. And what I would advise many of you younger black men that are thinking about getting involved in the manosphere, the black manosphere, study Dr. Thomas Sowell. Find out what this brother's really about. See, he's not spoken on highly in the black community because a lot of black folks think or they believe he's a sellout or whatever, whatever term they want to use. He's a brilliant man. And he's not about no foolishness and he's not about no nonsense. So the black manosphere, you're bullshit, man. You're straight bullshit, man. And the panels that you have on your YouTube channels support you not having, support you being fatherless. Because I got to tell you, all the stuff that I see in those panels, you don't have any decorum. You're disrespectful. Every other word out your mouth is nigga this, nigga that, nigga this, nigga that. But yet, you demand that the world respect black men. So Black Manosphere, how is it on these platforms? You provide entertainment, but yet you're demanding the world to respect you as black men. See, entertainment doesn't go well with non-entertainment. My YouTube channel is non-entertainment. It's for fathers of daughters. That's my purpose. Your YouTube channels are strictly entertainment, but yet you want the world, you want other ethnic groups and other cultures to take your black asses serious. Come on now. All you have to do is look at your panels that you can't control. I don't know where you're finding these brothers from, but everybody got something to say. That's what YouTube has created. You don't have to know shit. Show up on a panel. This is how I feel. This is my opinion. If you don't get on my page, come on. Y'all straight foolish. Don't know what you're talking about because you don't research. Sad. Disturbingly sad. I don't understand it. Help me understand, black men. You're younger. You're supposed to be wiser, so you say. Okay. Okay. Foolishness. Nonsense. 300 videos. No consistency. No, there is consistency. Bullshit. So many bullshit millennial and Gen Z, man. Amazing. Simply amazing. Okay, black fam. Let me get video number 2 set up.
Especially good in New York at that time.
Okay, black fam. This is video number 2 by Dr. Thomas Sowell.
The culture in which they grew up was not the culture in which black kids grew up in America today.
So they
There's
had
no gangster rap available in Germany.
Go on here. I think I'm free.
I mean,
Black family.
the average of black kid today, I think, is probably better off, certainly materially,
Let me see.
than say Ben Carson was when he was growing up.
Ben Carson, the famous
Black
surgeon at
neurosurgeon.
Johns Hopkins,
Right.
Okay,
right.
black family.
who is immensely accomplished
try to
in
reload.
every way.
Yes.
Right.
Give me
I
a
would
second
say
here. I'm
that
gonna stop it. I'm
the
going to try to
black
reload.
kids who are growing up today,
Give me a second. See what's going on. Okay. It appears that I'm back online. I think I had an internet issue, black family. Let me try this again. Let me try this again. See what we got.
the culture in which they grew up was the culture in which they grew up was not this culture in which black kids grew up in America today.
So they had
There's no gangster rap. I mean, the average of black kid today, I think, is probably better off, certainly materially, than say Ben Carson was when he was growing up.
Ben Carson, the famous
Black
surgeon at
neurosurgeon.
Johns Hopkins.
Right.
Who is immensely accomplished in every way.
Yes.
Right.
I would say that certainly the black kids who are growing up today have a higher material standard of living than I had. The difference was that the schools were good when I came along. They were especially good in New York at that time, hard as that is to believe. But the kids who grew up in that same place where I lived, they will not get that same education. Now that can be blamed on somebody, but it has very little to do with what happened 100 or 200 years ago. And it's true in other countries. I mean, in Nigeria, for example, there's a tribe, the Igbos, who are living in one of the least fertile parts of Nigeria, who were in fact enslaved in centuries past by other tribes and so on. When the British moved in and set up schools, the Igbos went for the schools. By the time Nigeria became independent, the Igbos had climbed above the other groups that had been ahead of them to begin with. But there are all kinds of cross currents of factors. The particular culture or the particular geography, you run through the whole list of them.
You cite in Intellectuals and Race, you cite an observation by the intelligence expert, IQ scientist, James Flynn, that just stopped me cold.
Mm.
After the Second World War, you've got large numbers of American troops remaining in Germany. For that matter, there's still several tens of thousands there today. And both black and white American soldiers had children with German women.
Mm.
And Flynn discovered that those children growing up in Germany showed no IQ differences at all.
Mm.
The black kids and the white kids, the same. Quoting Intellectuals and Race, Professor Flynn concluded that the reason was that the offspring of black soldiers in Germany, and now you're quoting Professor Flynn, grew up in a nation with no black subculture, close quote. Which means what? Which means they experienced exactly the same expectations. Is this
No, the expectations are external. The culture in which they grew up was not this culture in which black kids grew up in America today.
So they had.
There's no gangster rap that was pervasively available in Germany.
So here's what I'm getting. There is something about black subculture in America today that holds African Americans themselves back?
Yes. In fact, I went into this in a previous book on which about black rednecks and white liberals, because that same subculture.
Let's talk about two of your books here. Go ahead.
Because that very same subculture held whites in the South back as well. That in the time this mental testing in the First World War turned up, among other things, the fact that whites from various 4 or 5 southern states scored lower on the mental test than blacks from 4 or 5 northern states. And so it really was a question of the subculture that was there, which was a handicap to both.
All right. And so whose job is it to say, wrong subculture, folks, you're harming yourselves?
Well, I would think in an ideal world that intellectuals might take on that task, but the world that we live in, I've noticed, is not ideal.
All right. What is to be done? Take a look at President Lyndon Johnson speaking at Howard University in 1965.
Oh, yes.
But freedom is not enough. You do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying now, you are free to go where you want and do as you desire and choose the leaders you please. You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberating, bringing up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair.
It's pathetic. It's not a question of, there's no you who has the control to be completely fair or completely unfair. I mean, the circumstances are, so someone once criticized the mental tests on grounds that the tests were unfair. And and I think it was David Reisman who said the tests are not unfair. Life is unfair, and the tests are measuring the results. But who has control of life? Who has control of the past? Who has control of the culture that people have in the present, which they've inherited from the past?
So Lyndon Johnson, in fact, although good liberal that he was, at least in regard, Lyndon Johnson had a complicated career and changed positions on issues many times, but good liberal though he was at that moment, he was in fact engaging in a breathtaking arrogance.
Yes.
On two counts. One, that white people were the ones who were responsible for where black people stood in the race, that it was up to whites entirely, that blacks, as he described, I'm
devastating.
The black people are passive, they're acted upon.
That's right, that's right.
And then the second act of arrogance is the supposition that somehow the federal government could fix it.
Yes, it is staggering. But if you wanted to be charitable, you could say, well, he said this in 1965. But if you say, all right, why are people now repeating it in 2013 when we've had nearly half a century of experience to the contrary? And if you look within the black community, those blacks who had escaped what I call the black redneck culture, they've moved on. So, but it's the culture the different parts of the black community had. They were different.
Daniel Patrick Moynihan, in his famous 1965 report entitled "The Negro Family: The Case for National Action," close quote. Longish quotation, but it gets to something, I believe. Moynihan, the fundamental problem is that of family structure. The Negro family in the urban ghettos is crumbling. A middle class has managed to save itself, but for vast numbers of the unskilled and poorly educated, the fabric of conventional social relationships has all but disintegrated. So long as this situation persists, the cycle of poverty and disadvantage will continue to repeat itself, close quote. When Moynihan wrote those words, the illegitimacy rate among African Americans was 25%. Today, the illegitimacy rate among white Americans is 36%, among Hispanics, more than 50%, and among African Americans, more than 70%.
Yes.
Aside from throwing up your hands in despair, what is to be done?
The first thing to be done is to understand that this was a result of policies begun in the 1960s. This is not a legacy of what happened 100 years before the 1960s.
The breakdown of the black family is not a legacy of slavery.
No, if you the classic study of this goes all the way back to the era of slavery, and they find that most black kids, even under slavery, had lived with two parents, and that was true all the way up until the 1960s. And so, if you really want to find out what has happened, what's changed, it has changed since the 1960s. And the fact that whites now have a higher rate of illegitimacy than blacks had when Moynihan wrote suggests that this is something that spreads out. But if you look at something else, if you look at those blacks, and look at black husband-wife families, the poverty rate among such families has been in single digits every year since 1994. And so if you look at the external causes, why the husband and wife families and the welfare single mom families all are facing the same society and objective things, but the results are radically different because the cultures and values are different.
So you would roll back welfare. I guess that's the principal policy. So what would Tom Sowell do? One, you'd eliminate welfare, you'd reform welfare. What would you do?
Roll it back.
All right. And what about affirmative action?
Eliminate it.
Just gone.
Yeah.
Colorblind policy completely. All right. What prospect for that do you see?
None.
No black leader of any standing. I'm talking about a political leader as opposed to an intellectual such as yourself. You've got, there's you There's Walter Williams. Do you get the sense that there's a growing generation, a rising generation of African-American intellectuals who say, enough of this, I'm with Tom Sowell?
Well, I don't know if they'll go that far. There's no point.
That would be asking a lot.
There's no point being reckless. But I think there are people like Shelby Steele and many others, Larry Elder. You can run through a long list, and there are more such people now than there were, say, in the 1970s. But in terms of political leaders, all the incentives politically are for Black leaders to blame all problems in the Black community on the larger society. And that enables them to take on the role of being the defender of the Black community against enemies, which in turn creates the situation in which many Blacks don't feel that anything that they do is going to help themselves unless it's done politically as a group. That there's no point. I mean, why would you, if you believe what they say, why would you want to knock yourself out in school knowing that the man is not going to let you get anywhere? One of the most pathetic things I heard in recent years was a young Black man saying that, at one point he thought he would join the Air Force and become a pilot. And then he says he realized that the white man is not going to let a Black man become a pilot. And he was saying this decades after the Tennessee Airmen had established their reputation in combat in Europe. But the hopelessness is one of the big products of the race industry. That you have no chance. I remember giving a talk at Marquette, and at the end of the talk, among the questions that was asked, a young Black man got up and he said, "Even though I am graduating from Marquette University, what hope is there for me?" And having gone through college when I was in the 50s, I don't remember any Blacks saying that in the 1950s, when there was a lot more obstacles to overcome than there were when this guy is graduating from Marquette. But you have to produce that kind of feeling in order to serve the interests of those in the race industry.
Final question then. Maybe we can think in terms of that young man at Marquette, or let's put it this way. Somewhere watching this interview, there's a young Thomas Sowell. There's an African American who's smart and wants to do something with his life. It seems to me we've already got one piece of advice you'd offer to him is stay away from the races industry. Stay away from the race hustlers. What advice would you give a young Thomas Sowell? How do you make something of yourself as an African American in America today?
The way anybody else would. You equip yourself with skills that people are willing to pay for.
Black Family. Video number 2 by the brilliant, Thomas Sowell. Dr. Thomas Sowell. With all due respect, let me give him his props because he is a doctor in education. So, Black man in the Manosphere. What you're trying to do is you're trying to create a subculture of single Black mothers within our culture. And you're trying to ostracize them. And you're trying to isolate them. And you're trying to disrespect them. That's what you're doing. That's what your purpose is of the Black Manosphere. But I know who you brothers are. You're weak Black men. That's what you are. You're a bunch of weak Black men. And Black women, as a father of 4 adult daughters, let me give you some advice. Stay away from and stay off of these Black Manosphere platforms. Don't participate in them. See, what you ladies are failing to realize is all the shit they talk about, how they don't want women and they don't want to listen to women and deal with women. They need you in their platforms because guess what? They know that sex sells. Men will not support other men on a platform without women being involved. You know why? Because their platforms are entertainment, ladies. And while they're monetizing off their Cash App, PayPal, their Patreons, you ladies are looking simple and stupid because that's their goal. They don't give a shit about you. They don't give a damn about how you feel or how you look because they have no problem with exploiting you. So any of these black men that are talking about they care about black women, look at their platforms. Because if this is how you care about black women, you obviously don't love your wives, and you sure as hell don't love your mothers. Because there's no respect here. There's a lot of hypocrisy, though, but there's no respect. Black women, you're being exploited. You should never, ever want to be a part of a male-dominated space. I don't want my daughters in a male-dominated space because I know there's bullshit men. I grew up with bullshit men. I know what men talk about in locker rooms. I know what men talk about in the barber shop. There's a lot of bullshit men. And I can promise you, ladies, black women, by the year 2030, the majority of these black men that are in the Manosphere, their platforms, they'll be gone. See, they're making their money now because they know the lonely man industry is paying out huge in economics. They know this. And this is why they're pimping the younger man. This is why they're doing what they're doing with these younger men, because they're easy to manipulate. So ladies, that's my advice to you as a father of 4 adult daughters, black girls. I have black daughters. Stay out of men's spaces. They can't make you better, and they're not conducive for you. Do your thing, ladies, on YouTube. You're doing fine. You don't need black men. You don't need black men. You don't. You're doing perfectly fine. But they need you because they need to monetize. And that's exactly what it is, black women. Okay, fam, we have one more video by Dr. Thomas Sowell. Give me a second to set it up.
State.
Okay, black fam. The third and final video by Dr. Thomas Sowell, economist.
Well, you're creating a situation where if the man stays there, the government will not give the woman welfare, and if he leaves, it will. And so they're paying. When you pay people not to get married, more people don't get married.
Most black children were being raised in 2-parent families in 1960. 30 years after the liberal welfare state, the great majority of black children were being raised by single parents.
Yes.
How does that, by the way, we should note that Patrick Moynihan publishes the Moynihan Report in 1965.
Yes.
And he's alarmed because the illegitimacy rate among black families is 25% then. Now, among whites, it's over a third.
Yes.
Hispanics, it's over half. And among African Americans, it's over 70%. What's going on there?
Well, this is again, this too, you find the same thing in Britain. You find it in France and Norway. You find it in the Western world. In fact,
The dissolution of the family structure.
Oh, yeah. There are any number of Western nations where 40% of the children are raised with only one parent.
Right.
At the extremes, Compared to Asian countries, at the extremes, Iceland, it's 2 out of 3 children born are raised in a single parent home. In South Korea, it's 1 out of 66.
Wow. Wow. And so what, that's the welfare state? What?
Yes,
it is.
Oh, you're paying, you're creating a situation where if the first of all, you're creating a situation where if the man stays there, the government will not give the woman welfare, and if he leaves, they will. And so they're paying. When you pay people not to get married, more people don't get married.
Quote, Black Americans, a group often identified as beneficiaries of the welfare state in America, made considerable economic progress in the 20th century. Fine, of course, but much, if not most, this is the thing with you, the dependent clause is where the sting is, but much, if not most, of this progress was prior to the massive expansion of the American welfare state, close quote. That is so I want to say counterintuitive, because we hear so much about African-American progress since civil rights and the establishment of the welfare state that it really has become a kind of American intuition. Explain yourself, Dr. Soul.
Well, as of 1940, 87% of Black households were in poverty. Over the next 20 years, that declined to 47%. This is all prior to the civil rights laws, prior to the social welfare policies of the Johnson administration. Over the next 20 years, it fell an additional 18 points. But that was not, that was just the same trend continuing at a reduced rate. Affirmative action is even worse, because as I remember, I'm trying to think now, the numbers. I think it was something like, poverty rate was something like 30% among Black households before affirmative action. And a decade after affirmative action, it was 29%. This is not the same as the 40% decline that occurred before there were any civil rights laws and before there was any social welfare state.
And so what happened between 1940 and 1960 was the post-Second World War economic boom.
It was that, right? but it was also the massive migration of Blacks out of the South.
So they're getting better education and jobs.
That's right.
Okay. Now, you mentioned cultural and social retrogressions. Again, I'm quoting you. Arguably, the most consequential of these was the decline in two-parent families.
Yes.
Close quote. Explain that one. Among African Americans.
Yes.
We're still talking about African Americans.
Well, you know, when they talk about things like this, they talk about the legacy of slavery.
Right.
And I argue, well, empirically, it's not that. It's the legacy of the welfare state. Because as of 1960, which is almost 100 years after slavery ended, the majority of Black kids were being raised in two-parent households. But within one generation after the welfare state, that had dropped down to a minority. So that the majority of Black kids today are raised in one-parent households. When you think about it, I mean, centuries of slavery and generations of Jim Crow did not destroy the Black family, but one generation of the welfare state did.
The Moynihan Report, what was it? A call for national action.
Yes.
The Negro family, a call for national action, 1965, and even
Right.
50 years ago. And his principal point of alarm, and again, now I'm trying to recall the statistics, but I believe the out-of-wedlock birth rate among African Americans in 1965 was 25%.
Something like that, yeah.
And he was so alarmed that he wrote this report, and today it's over 70%. And
Yes.
by the way, the rate among whites is over 1/3 at this stage.
Yes.
So how does the family breakdown fit into an economic understanding? Is it something, the social breakdown of the American family is something that we have to understand aside from the tools of economics? It just doesn't fit into supply and demand curves and economic history?
This occurred at a time when the Black income was rising. And so we're saying that previous generations of Blacks with lower income and more racial barriers the family stuck together under those conditions. And under the new conditions, which were advertised to make for great progress in fact, created retrogressions. And I think many people who were gung-ho for the idea that this was going to be progress simply cannot bring themselves to look at the evidence and say, my God, we made things worse.
Economic facts and fallacies. A fallacy is that the current fatherless families so prevalent among contemporary Blacks are a legacy of slavery, where families were not recognized under slavery. This ignores the fact that the problem has become much worse among generations of Blacks far removed from slavery than among generations closer to the era of slavery, close quote. Explain that.
You mean explain why it is so, or
Yeah, see, why is that? What on earth is going on there? That is so counter to what we assume.
Well, first of all, the people, most people have not recognized the fact that that if you go back into the 20s, you find that married couple families were much more prevalent among Blacks then than today. You find also, incidentally, that the Blacks were had as late as 1930, Blacks had lower unemployment rates than whites. So all these things that we complain about and attribute to the era of slavery, those things should have been worse in the past than in the present.
Right.
But in fact, they're worse in the present than in the past. And I think if you want to look for a turning point, it would be since the 1960s.
And what happened in the 1960s?
Oh, you began to have not only the welfare state, you began to have the mindset that goes with the welfare state, so that there was no stigma any longer attached, for example, to being on relief or welfare.
And so, but why? Well, illegitimacy is exploding now among, it's high among Hispanics,
Yes.
and it's exploding among whites. But the Moynihan report, when was that, Tom?
Or in the 60s, 64, 65.
When Moynihan talked about the illegitimacy rate among
Yes.
Blacks, which was exploding then. So what if the welfare state changes the way Americans think?
Yes.
Why did Black Americans prove susceptible to that change first?
Because they were poor. I don't think that many Asian American girls who are preparing to go off to Stanford or Harvard are going to say, hey, well, I can live on welfare. Why should I abstain?
Nothing so turns the tables on critics of social pathology in the Black community as invoking the painful history of slavery. But because slavery has left bitter legacies, it does not follow that any particular bitter experience among Blacks today can automatically be attributed to slavery. Cancer is indeed fatal, but every fatality cannot be attributed to cancer, and certainly not after an autopsy has shown death to be due to a heart attack or gunshot wounds. One of the key misfortunes within the contemporary Black community, from which many other misfortunes flow, is the breakdown of the family, or the failure to form a family in the first place. As of 1992, more than half of all Black adults had never been married, quite aside from an additional 16% who had been either divorced or widowed. By contrast, only 21% of white adults had never been married. More than half of all Black children, 57%, were living with only one parent, and another 7.5% were not living with either parent. Thus, only a little more than a third of Black children were living in traditional two-parent households. The great majority of those Black children who were living with only one parent were living with their mothers, and more than half of these mothers were unmarried. The all too common and all too tragic situation was the teenage mother, children having children. Of 190,000 Black children whose parents were currently still teenagers, only 5,000 were living with both parents. This, of course, does not include all those children whose mothers were teenagers when they were born, but whose mothers were 20 years old or older at the time the Census Bureau collected the statistics. In short, it underestimates the extent of teenage motherhood and the consequences that continue long after the mother has reached 20 years of age. Children having children is a deadly situation, whether from the standpoint of physical health, babies born to teenage mothers being prone to more medical disabilities, or from the standpoint of the inability or unwillingness of teenage mothers to raise those children with the knowledge, skills, and values necessary for them to become productive and law-abiding adults. Since many of these teenage girls are high school dropouts and are otherwise lacking in the discipline, knowledge, and maturity necessary to raise a child, they can hardly be expected to give the child what they themselves do not have. The tragedy of the situation is too obvious to require elaboration. As in other areas where violations of societal norms have led to disasters, the first order of business for the anointed has been to turn the tables on society, which must itself be made to feel guilty for what it complains of. Blaming a legacy of slavery for the high levels of unwed teenage pregnancy among blacks and the abdication of responsibility by the fathers of the children clearly performs that function. Whether it is actually true is another question, and one receiving remarkably little attention. Going back 100 years, when blacks were just one generation out of slavery, we find that the census data of that era showed that a slightly higher percentage of black adults had married than had white adults. This, in fact, remained true in every census from 1890 to 1940. Prior to 1890, this question was not included in the census, but historical records and contemporary observations of the Reconstruction era depicted desperate efforts of freed black men and women to find their lost mates, children, and other family members, efforts continuing on for years and even decades after the Civil War. Slavery had separated people, but it had not destroyed the family feelings they had for each other, much less their desire to form families after they were free. As late as 1950, 72% of all black men and 81% of black women had been married. But the 1960 census showed the first signs of a decline that accelerated in later years, as so many other social declines began in the 1960s. This new trend, beginning a century after emancipation, can hardly be explained as a legacy of slavery, and might more reasonably be explained as a legacy of the social policies promoted by the anointed, especially since similar social policies led to similarly high rates of unwed motherhood in Sweden, where neither race nor slavery could be held responsible. Looking more closely at the history of broken homes and female-headed households in the United States, we find that both have long been more prevalent among blacks than among whites, although the differences were not always as dramatic as they are today. The higher levels of broken homes among blacks in the past were due in part to higher mortality rates among blacks, leaving more widows and widowers, but there were also more family breakups. None of this was unique to blacks, however. The Irish went through a similar social history in 19th century American cities. But the female-headed households of an earlier era, whether among blacks or whites, were seldom headed by teenage girls. As of 1940, among black females who headed their own households, 82% were 40 years old or older. Moreover, only 14% of all black children were born to unmarried women at that time. The whole situation was radically different from what it is today. Whatever factors caused the changes, these were clearly 20th century factors, not a legacy of slavery.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas Sewell, economist. You're a brilliant man. You are much loved and appreciated. Thank you, brother. Thank you for sharing. Dr. Thomas Sewell is 93 years of age. He's lived a long life, and his brilliance will continue on. Black Manosphere. Malcolm X once said, a wise man can play the art of a clown, but a clown can't play the role of a wise man. That's a Malcolm X quote. Black Manosphere, you're a bunch of clowns. And that's the role you're playing. You're a bunch of clowns. You know, it's amazing to me how so many of you content creators, you love the quote, empirical evidence, empirical research. When you're talking about divorce, 70% of women in the United States file for divorce. Facts. Those are facts. But let me tell you what the problem is with your argument when you come for Black women to support your claims that they're a subculture within the Black culture. The problem with that is your evidence is all anecdotal. Right? When I come across your platforms, all you talk about is anecdotal evidence. But it's problematic because most of you do not understand how statistics work, how data works, how research works. There's 19 different types of research, Black Manosphere. Google it. Use Siri or Alexa. because that's what your generation does. Since you don't do any damn research, Google it. Okay, there's 19 types of different research. But when we're talking about anecdotal evidence, you swear by it, Black man. You live by it, Black man. But it's problematic on many, many levels. And let me explain to you why. When you're using anecdotal evidence, it's qualitative by nature. It's qualitative research. It's a generalization, Black men. You can't justify anecdotal research by using empirical research to support your claims, because empirical research is quantitative. I'm sorry. Empirical research is quantitative research. It's numerical, Black men. So that's the problem that you're going to have. Anecdotal and empirical, they're apples and oranges. So you can't support your claims with Black women, trying to make them a subgroup within Black culture. That's not going to fly. See, I'm a legal researcher. So I know your angle. And you can't defend the indefensible, Black men. You can try. And that's what you do on your platforms. But you can't defend the indefensible. You brothers don't even know what you're doing. You don't understand the research that you do provide. Can't explain it. I've seen you on other platforms, on non-Black platforms, where white men have jammed you because you brothers don't know what you're talking about. So you're safer to stay in your little Black platforms. Yeah, I said it, little Black platforms. You're safer there because your subscribers, they're going to follow your foolishness and nonsense because most of them don't know any better. So you're safe on your Black platforms. May want to stay there, but most of you brothers will be gone by 2030 anyway. So Black Manosphere, do understand, I'm not going to allow you to disrespect Black women. I have 4 adult Black daughters. I'm not going to allow you to disrespect Black single mothers because of your own shortcomings of not having fathers in your lives and being raised by single mothers. You're no better than Black women. You're not. Deal with it, Black man. Get the therapy that you need because you're telling Black women they need it. You're telling Black women to work on their issues, but you have the same issues, but you refuse to address it. Hypocrisy. Come on, Black men, really? All right, fam. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for being a part of today's live stream. In the description, I have Thomas Sewell's 3 videos, along with 4 videos of my own that I've addressed the Black Manosphere on in earlier videos. Feel free to look at all of them. And feel free, Black content creators, when you come across this video, because I'm sure you will, and I'm sure it's going to be shared amongst you, feel free to do a reaction video on any of my videos, of my content. I give you full permission. I dare you to do a reaction video. I dare you, Black content creators, because none of you punk ass Black man, you can do what I do. None of you. You don't have the life experience. You don't have the professional experience. You don't have the resume experience. But feel free to pick any one of my live streams, any one of my replay videos, and do a live, do a reaction video. I give you full permission. You don't got to ask me. I give you full permission. Please do. I dare you. Because I would love to come back on that and destroy you. And destroy your argument and destroy your position. Because I know what you bullshit men are going to try to do. But like I say, you don't need my permission. I'm not going to go to YouTube and cry. And you don't have to worry about any of that. See, I don't get down like that. I know most of you Black male content creators, because you're doing reaction videos, you cry to YouTube and you claim it's your own work. No, it's not. When someone else uses what you're saying and what you're doing, you cry foul. Interesting. You get your information from everyone else because none of your content is original. That's why I can't respect you, because you're a bunch of punk ass men. Yeah, you are. All right, fam. I'm out. Until next week's live stream. Peace.